afternoon, class. Today we will continue with our discussions on Chapter 3, the different kinds of obligations. We will discuss Section 2, obligations with a period. Our source material again for this lecture will be Obligations and Contracts by De Leon and De Leon Jr. So let's begin with the definition of an obligation with a period, or otherwise known as a periodic obligation. So remember, an obligation with a period is affected by the expiration or arrival of a period or a term. So ang kailangan lang natin tandaan sa obligations with a period, may effect sa kanya yung expiration or arrival ng isang period or term. So please take note of the definition of period or term. It is a future and certain event upon the arrival of which the obligation or right subject to it either arises or is terminated, depending on what kind of periodic obligation it is. So again here, you have to differentiate ano ba ang pinagkaiba ng period at saka yung pinag-usapan natin doon sa section 1, yung condition. Again, a condition is a future and uncertain event. So, kung ang pinag-uusapan natin is hindi mo alam kung mangyayari or hindi, ibig sabihin ito ay isang condition. Pagka ang pinag-uusapan natin is alam mong mangyayari, it's just a matter of time kung kailan siya mangyayari. Ano lang, oras lang ang binibilang, araw lang ang binibilang. Now, remember, if ganun ang condition, or ang ganun ang pinag-uusapan, remember that this refers to a period. So anyway, in your book, you will see yung period at saka condition, they have been distinguished from one another. So as to fulfillment, remember, a period is a certain event, katulad nga ng sinabi ko kanina, it is sure to happen. Pwedeng alam mo kung kailan, pero pwede rin hindi mo alam kung kailan. Basta ang point dito is, mangyayari siya. Yun ang period. Now, a condition is, again, an uncertain event. Hindi mo alam kung mangyayari ba siya or hindi. As to time, remember, period will always refer to the future. A condition refers to the future but may also refer to the past. So, past event unknown to the parties. So, again, ang nire-refer ng past event unknown to the parties is yung future knowledge of a past event. So that will be yung condition. What else? As to influence to obligation, period fixes the time or efficaciousness of an obligation. Alam mong magiging obligasyon mo talaga to. It's just a matter of time. Kaya nga, time of performance, efficaciousness, kailan ba siya magiging effective? Yun ang tanong sa periodic obligation. But remember, class, in case of a condition, it will cause an obligation to either arise or to cease. So, yun ang tandaan natin. Whether or not it will arise, depende pa yan kung mangyayari, or cease, depende pa yan kung mangyayari or hindi yung condition. So, as to effect, remember, when it is left to the debtor's will, period dependent upon the debtor's will only empower the courts to fix the period. In case of a condition dependent upon the sole will of the debtor, the condition potestative on the part of the debtor is, remember, invalid. It invalidates actually the entire obligation. Retroactive effect, remember, unless there is a stipulation to that effect, the arrival of the period does not have any retroactive effect. Pero pagdating sa condition, it has, remember, retroactive effect. So, this is what you have to remember, class. Uulit-ulitin ko. Pagka alam mo na mangyayari ito, pero hindi mo alam kung kailan, pwede rin namang alam mo kung kailan, pero anyway, alam mo or hindi mo alam kung kailan, basta alam mo na mangyayari, we are referring to a period. If we are not even sure whether or not something will happen, it is a condition. So anyway, a period must be possible. If the period is impossible, the obligation is void. So remember, periods must refer to the future. It must be certain. It must be physically and legally possible period. Otherwise, the obligation is void. So please take note of a day certain. So it must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. Kaya nga, period siya, class, kasi darating at darating. It's just a matter of time, maybe alam mo, maybe hindi. So anyway, the kinds of periods according to effect, yung suspensive period or XDE, ibig sabihin, this is a period or term with a suspensive effect, meaning obligation, wala muna siya ngayon, but the obligation will begin after the arrival, only from a day certain. So upon arrival of the period, dun mag-uumpisa yung obligation. So, example, bibigyan kita ng baon starting ng first day ng next year. So, kailan ka, o next month na lang para hindi naman masyadong malayo. Bibigyan kita ng baon starting ng first day next month. So, alam mong bibigyan ka ng baon, sigurado kang bibigyan ka ng baon. It's just a matter of time na dumating yung period na para mag-umpisa yung obligation. So, remember, it is a future and a certain event. So, it will become effective on the day stipulated. Bibigyan ka talaga ng baon. Naghihintay lang ng panahon. Ngayon, pagdating ng panahon na yon, yung, wow, pagdating ng panahon, my God, kinaisasigera ko talaga. O anyway, na-distract ako doon. So, pagka dumating yung, ano nga yan, February, March 1, sigurado ka mabibigyan ka ng baon. It's just a matter of time, future and certain to happen na event. Now, in case naman of also, i-add nyo na lang siguro to. Obligations whose fulfillment a day certain has been fixed, demandable only when the day comes. So, kung dumating yung araw, that is the only time that it is demandable. So, kasi di ba sinabi ko rin na obligation begins only from a day certain. So, obviously, it will be demandable only when that day comes. So, anyway, yung resolutory period naman, indiem, period or term with a resolutory effect. So, the obligation is effective immediately. So, it is an obligation that is demandable at once. Effective siya kaagad. PAC. Ito na naman tayo sa PAC. No? So, effective siya kaagad. But remember, because it is a resolutory period, upon the arrival of the period, the obligation is terminated. Bibigyan kita ng baon hanggang March 1. So, kailan kita bibigyan ng baon? Now na, PAC, bigyan kita ng baon. Pero kailan ang last day niya? Hanggang March 1 lamang. So, remember, in case of a resolutory, an obligation with a resolutory period, the obligation is immediately existing, immediately demandable, but it is only up to a certain time. According to a source, remember, legal period, it is the period granted under the provisions of law. Tandaan nyo sa kahit na anong bagay, basta sinabing legal, law lagi ang pinanggagalingan yan. What else? Pagka conventional naman or voluntary, always the period stipulated by the parties. Or basta narinig nyo yung term na conventional or voluntary, laging by agreement yan. So, what else? Judicial period, it is imposed by the courts. So, it is the term fixed by the courts for the performance of an obligation or for the termination of an obligation. Remember, yung time element, pwedeng it will give rise to the obligation. Yung time element also can extinguish a pre-existing obligation. According to definiteness, definite period, alam mo kung kailan. December, bibigyan kita ng baon, ng pera, December 25, 2021. So, kailan ka bibigyan ng baon? December 25, 2021. Indefinite period, bibigyan kita ng baon kapag ka namatay si X. So, remember, you know surely that X will die because everybody dies, as I've said a while ago, as I've said sa section 1. But remember, the date of happening is unknown. So, hindi natin alam kung kailan mamamatay si X. I hope soon, but hindi natin alam, di ba? So, anyway, something will surely happen, hindi nyo alam. So, bibigyan kita ng pera pagka namatay si X. Sana mamatay si X kaagad para mabigyan ka ng pera kaagad. You know it will happen, but you do not know when. Sigurado kang mangyayari, pero hindi mo alam kung kailan mangyayari. So, remember here, class, where the period is not fixed, but a period is intended by the parties, the courts are usually empowered to fix the same. Anyway, we will go back to this when we go doon sa iba nating topics. Please take note also, class, of the rules regarding periods. So, the first rule is the rule in 1194. in case of loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before the arrival of the suspensive period. So obviously, we are talking here about a real obligation. We are talking about a suspensive period imposed on the obligation. So yung suspensive or yung XJ, again, your Latin terms, please remember. So bago pa lang, pagka suspensive periods, obligation subject to a suspensive period, the obligation is not yet demandable. Kailan siya magiging demandable? Pagkadating nung period that is agreed upon by the parties. Now, in the meantime, while hinihintay na dumating yung period, remember, naghihintay lang tayo dito kasi nga, period ang pinag-uusapan natin, future and certain event. Now, in the meantime, while waiting for the period to arrive, there may be loss, deterioration, or improvement of the object. So, before the arrival nga of the period. Now, these are the rules in 1194. Actually, yung rules sa 1194 are found in 1189, which we have already studied. So, familiar na sa inyo to. So, in case of loss, deterioration, etc., etc., the rules in 1189 shall be observed. So, yun ang nakalagay sa provision. So, ulitin ko, if the loss of the thing is without the debtor's fault, obligation is extinguished as a general rule. Anyway, it is not the fault of the debtor na habang hindi pa dumarating yung time, the object is destroyed. Now, loss of the thing through the debtor's fault, or it is the debtor who destroys the object. Remember, debtor will be obliged to pay for damages. Now, in case of deterioration or impairment of the thing without the debtor's fault, creditor will suffer deterioration, impairment, or reduction in value. So, hindi naman kasalanan again ng debtor ito. So, it is the creditor who will suffer deterioration or impairment. Anyway, if there is improvement of the thing, it is also the debtor who will get the improvement. What else? In case of deterioration of the thing through the debtor's fault, again here, the creditor has a choice to rescind the obligation or to ask for fulfillment, and again with damages in either case. So whatever is the choice of the creditor, he can ask for damages. Tuloy natin plus damages, or cancel na lang natin, rescind natin plus damages. What else? If improvement by nature or by time, again, creditor benefits because the creditor suffers impairment or deterioration. What else? Improvement of the thing at the expense of the debtor, again, rights of usufructuary. So if the usufructuary can remove yung kanyang improvements, pwede niyang gawin as long as it will not cause damage to the principal, and also the usufructuary will not be paid for improvements made to the property. So yun ang tandaan natin. Rules in 1189 also applicable to obligations with a suspensive period. In 1195, remember this is payment before arrival of the period. So remember here class na if the debtor hindi pa dumarating yung period, unaware siya sa period or believing that the obligation has become due and demandable, remember mistakenly believing that the obligation has become due and demandable, he may recover yung kanyang payment with fruits and also interest. So obviously, this will apply only to real obligations. Hindi pwedeng mag-apply to sa personal obligations because physically impossible to recover services. So kung nagkaroon kayo ng premature performance, premature performance sa personal obligations, hindi nyo pwedeng bawiin yung service na inyong inirender plus fruits and interest. It's impossible. So anyway, this rule is based on the creditor being prohibited to unjustly enrich or benefit through the retention of the thing or money which is not yet due and demandable because the period has not yet arrived. So remember also that here the creditor is presumed to be aware of the period. Ang burden of proof na hindi niya alam na premature yung payment niya or hindi niya alam na hindi pa pala due date is on the debtor. So kailangan siyang magpatunay na binayaran ko, yes. Pero kasi akala ko due na, hindi pa pala due. Kasi ang alam ko, mali pala ako, etc. Akala ko ganito, etc. So remember, the debtor is presumed to be aware. So kailangan niyang patunayan na actually hindi siya aware sa period. So anyway, in case also of presumption of period, kailangan yung tandaan na the debtor cannot recover anymore yung thing or money paid if yung principal amount that is paid or delivered if the period has already arrived. Now, with respect to fruits or interest from the date of premature payment, remember, pwede pa niyang i-recover yung mga yon. So, let us say class, si A at saka si B, creditor and debtor. Let us say, sige, debtor and creditor na lang para hindi na tayo mahirapan. Anyway, si debtor, nangutang siya kay creditor. So, kailangan niyang bayaran in 2 weeks at time. So, anyway, mistakenly si debtor, akala niya lumagpas na yung 2 weeks, yung pala 1 week pa lang. So, binayaran na niya yung kanyang obligation. Remember here, there is premature payment on the part of the debtor. So, the debtor, if the debtor can prove that he was unaware of the period, kasi remember, presumption yun na aware siya. So, you have to overcome yung presumption. So, if the debtor can prove that he is unaware of the period, remember, he can recover his money with fruits and interest pa. So, yun ang tandaan natin. Now, remember, yung kanyang recovery of fruits and interest is from the time of payment until it is actually returned to him. Now, what if, in the meantime, habang hindi pa na ibabalik yung kanyang pera, bigla, nag-due na talaga yung obligation, yung utang. So, remember, he can no longer recover yung principal amount na kanyang inutang, but can recover yung fruits and interest thereof from, again, premature performance up to the date of maturity of the obligation. Hanggang sa mag-mature lang yung obligation. So again, class, these are the rules on recovery as restated. So if the debtor is not aware that the payment is not yet due, obviously, class, he can recover before maturity. So regarding what he has paid plus fruits and interest. So kung ang due date ay, again, anong araw ngayon? February 3. So let us say ang due date is March 3, pero binayaran niya ng February 25. So yun ang pagkabayad niya. Remember, pwede niyang i-recover yon debt as long as yung payment made, as long as the obligation is not yet due. So, pwede niyang i-recover yung principal amount plus fruits and interest up to the time na ibalik ito ng debtor. So, from February 25, let us say, binalik siya ng March 1. So, pwede niyang i-recover yon principal and also fruits and interest up to that time. Tapos, after maturity naman, pwede siyang mag-recover ng interest. Because remember here that the creditor is in bad faith for having accepted payment when he knows that it is not yet due and demandable. So, pagka nag-mature na rin, let us say class February 25, binayaran, tapos hindi pa na ibabalik hanggang March 3 yung due date. So, actually, yung due date dumating na. So, he can recover yung interest ng pera. So, from the time of premature payment up to the maturity date. So, this right to recover yung interest will prescribe or expire. Yung term na prescribe, tandaan natin, expire 5 years after premature payment. Now, the rule is that if the debtor is aware that the payment is not yet due, there can be, remember here, no, ano ba yan? Babalik ko. There can be, remember, no recovery. Bakit? No recovery of principal paid and there can also be no recovery of interest. Bakit? Kasi, remember, this is an implied waiver of the right to use the period. So, yun ang tandaan natin when it comes to 1195. How about 1196? So, remember, presumption as to benefit of the period, the general presumption is that the period is presumed to be established for the benefit of both creditor and debtor. Bakit nagbe-benefit ang creditor sa period? Kasi kung halimbawa nagpautang ng pera, mas malaki ang interest na babayaran kung mas matagal ang utang. Also, the debtor benefits from the period kasi more time to pay. So, as a general rule, class, remember, hanggat hindi pa nag-expire yung period, the debtor cannot pay yung obligation. Creditor cannot demand also yung fulfillment kung hindi pa nag-expire yung period. So, in short, debtor cannot prematurely pay, creditor cannot demand prematurely. Ulitin ko, debtor cannot prematurely pay, creditor cannot demand prematurely. So, yun ang tandaan natin. Sundin natin kung ano yung period kasi pareho naman tayong makikinabang dyan, both creditor and debtor. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. Yun ang general rule. And remember, this presumption here, presumption is, again, rebuttable presumption. Rebuttable yan. So, if there is such intent na yun ang exception, so, ibig sabihin ng exception if there be such intent is that not both parties will benefit. Only one will benefit from the period. So if the term is for the benefit of the debtor alone, these are the rules. The debtor is required to pay only at the time of maturity. Pero pwede siyang mag-premature payment kung gusto niya. So the debtor can resist premature demand for compliance. Kailan lang siya pwedeng piliting magbayad? Upon maturity or upon due date. So, pwede siyang magbayad anytime, even before the due date, pero kung ikaw yung creditor, hindi mo mapipilit yung debtor na ito na magbayad before yung maturity. Kasi, remember, in this case, the benefit of the period is for the debtor alone. What about baliktarin? O if baliktarin natin, the term is for the benefit of the creditor alone. Creditor lang ang makikinabang sa period na yan. So, obvious na to. Creditor can demand payment at any time. So, pwede niyang ipabayad yung utang sa debtor anytime kasi siya lang naman ang nakikinabang sa period eh. Kung gusto niyang matagal hanggang sa due date, pwede niyang ipaabot hanggang sa due date. Pero kung gusto niya na maningil ng maaga, nangailangan siya, pwede rin because the benefit here is for the creditor alone. Also, yung creditor cannot be compelled to accept, cannot be forced to accept premature payment from the debtor. So, hindi pwedeng pilitin ng debtor, uy, tanggapin mo na itong bayad ko ngayon para mabawasan ng interest, etc., etc., para hindi na mag-interest next month. Hindi pwede yon. Creditor cannot be forced to accept a premature payment if the term is for the benefit of the creditor alone. So, also, class, in 1197, remember class, yung fixing of periods ng courts. So, the general rule is found in, actually, hindi, yung exceptions can be found in the provision of law, but this is the general rule. If the obligation does not state a period and no period is intended, the court is not authorized to fix a period. Remember here, class, that the courts have no right to make contracts for parties. Wala nga silang pinag-usapang period eh. Alangan namang the court will step in and bibigyan sila ng period na usapan. Hindi nga sila nag-agree na periodic yung obligation. Probably they agreed on a pure obligation. Tapos alangan namang magmagaling ang court at siya ang mag-impose ng period. Hindi. The courts will not make contracts for the parties. Remember that. Now, there is an exception when the courts can fix the term of a contract. So, number one, no period is fixed. Hindi lang nailagay kung anong period, but a period was intended. May pinag-usapan silang period. So, the obligation does not fix a period, but based from the nature of the obligation and the circumstances, the parties agreed that there is a period as to payment. May napag-usapan sila. Meron silang intention na magkaroon ng periodic obligation, but probably through inadvertence, hindi sinasadya, nakalimutan nila na maglagay ng fixed period doon sa contract nila. Now, here, class, remember, the court can step in to fix a period. Yan. So, the period fixed by the court will depend upon the nature and circumstances of the obligation as well as the intention of the parties. Now, if the duration of the period depends upon the will of the debtor as provided for in 1180, remember in 1180, I will pay when I have the money. I will pay when I want to. I will pay when I am able. So remember here, the period depends upon the will of the debtor. The payment actually depends upon the will of the debtor. Anong sabi sa 1180? Ito po ay periodic even if nakalagay yan sa chapter para sa conditional obligations. Yun yung sinasabi kong ligaw. So anyway, here, the courts will fix the period. So what really depends on the debtor is not the payment, but remember, he has promised talaga to pay. But the time when payment is to be made, yun ang hindi, yun ang nagdedepende sa debtor. So the court will be obliged to fix the duration of the period. So yun ang tandaan natin. So pagka dumating yung period that is set by the court, dun pa lang siya pwedeng mag-demand. So, yun ang tandaan natin sa 97. So anyway, please take note again that the courts cannot fix the term if no term was specified. Also, if the obligation is payable on demand, the courts cannot fix a period. Kasi nga, payable on demand eh. Alangan naman, pagka nag-demand ako ngayon, kailangan mo na bayaran ngayon. So, the courts cannot fix a period na, hindi, kailangan maghintay ka pa ng ganito. Hindi pwede yun because the obligation is payable on demand. And if specific periods are provided by law, let us say is as in employment contract, di ba sa employment contract, kailangan sumusweldo ka within a certain number of days, dapat twice a month. So, hindi pwedeng i-stipulate ng ano yan, parties yan, hindi pwedeng hindi pwedeng pakialaman ng court yung period which is already provided by law. So, periods fixed cannot be changed by the courts, meaning if there is a period agreed upon and it has already lapsed, the court cannot fix another period. So again, the courts cannot undertake to make contracts for parties. And from the very moment the parties give their acceptance and consent to the period fixed by the court, yun na yung contract nila. The contract will be subjected to such period fixed by the court. So parang yun na ang agreement nila. It becomes their law. So remember, a contract has binding force between the parties. So here, if the parties already accepted yung period fixed by the court, hindi na pwedeng palitan ng court yan. But the parties themselves obviously can modify the term or period by a new agreement. As you can see here, the parties, ano ba yan? Basta nakita nyo naman yun, may modify or fix the new term or agreement. So, how about, napahiya ako ng visit na drawing eklabo na to, no? So, anyway, 1198 naman, debtor will have the right to, shall lose the right to make use of a period. Remember the rule which I discussed a while ago. Ano bang rule yun? Let us see. 1196. So I discussed in 1196 that a period is for the benefit of both creditor and debtor. Now, in 1198, remember, the debtor loses the right to make use of the period or loses the benefit of the period in the following instances. So remember, number one, if the debtor becomes insolvent. Insolvent na nga si debtor, so dapat maningil ka na kaagad kung ikaw yung creditor. So the debtor also, yung mga obligation niya, hindi na subject to a period. Kasi nga, insolvent na siya, ang mga obligations niyan, immediately due and demandable na kaagad. Immediately na nga, due pa, kaagad pa. Anyway, unless he gives a guarantee or security for the debt. Ito yung tinatawag natin na collateral for the debt. I'm sure narinig nyo na yung term na prenenda, ganyan. So, magbibigay ka ng security or guarantee for the debt. So, kumuha ka ng guarantor, kumuha ka ng surety, or kumuha ka ng bagay na isasangla just to secure your obligation. So, anyway, pagka insolvent na siya, wala na siyang right to make use the period unless mag-fix siya ng security. What else? The debtor does not furnish guarantees or securities promised. So, nag-promise siya na magbibigay siya ng na isasangla niya yung lupa niya to secure the obligation. Na kung hindi niya sinangla yung, hindi niya provide yung lupa na sinasangla niya as a guarantee or a security for the payment of the obligation, the debtor will lose the right to a period. So, number 3, remember, when guarantees or securities given have been impaired or have disappeared through a fortuitous event. So, remember class, pagka yung debtor impairs yung guarantees or securities or through a fortuitous event, yung mga guarantees or securities na disappear, the debtor will lose the right to a period. So meaning the obligation becomes immediately due and demandable. Again, the exception is if he immediately gives a new uh, guarantees or securities which are equally satisfactory. Now, what you have to remember here, if through the fault of the debtor, yung security hindi kailangang totally destroyed. Kaya nga sabi ko sa inyo, impaired yung guarantees or securities. So, kung kasalanan ng debtor, hindi kailangang totally destroyed yung guarantees or securities to make him lose the right to use a period. But in case of a fortuitous event, it is required that the security must totally be destroyed or must totally disappear before the debtor will lose the right to a period. What else? Number 4, if the debtor violates an undertaking uh, to which he agreed to the period. And what else? Violation. Common sense lang yan, class. Obviously, will lose the right to a period kasi nga may violation or partial, may breach of contract. And number 5, when the debtor attempts to abscond or escape. Tumatakas na nga siya, bibigyan mo pa siya ng time para magbayad. Hindi na if nahuli mo because the debtor attempts to escape, the obligation will be immediately due and demandable. So anyway, that is it for obligations with a period or yung periodic obligations nga. Please stand by for section 3, yung alternative obligations. Anyway, class, have a good day. Thank you.